Hi, I'm Dave Gardy from Maritime TV from our studios here near Washington, D.C. for another ballast water treatment report. With me via Skype from New York is Steve Candito, CEO of Ecochlor. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Well, Dave, thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
I wanted to touch base with you about the recent Coast Guard attendance at the North American Ballast Water Tech Conference, where they recently, on November 12th, issued a summary of some of the discussions they had on their Maritime Commons blog. If I understand, there were 4 areas that they discussed: flow rate, type approval upgrade, hold time, and alternate components. Can you go through those for us just to give us a perspective of what they said?
Yeah, actually, they did cover even more issues than that, but these were some of the ones that I think were particularly important. So let me start with the flow rate issue. I think the point that the Coast Guard was trying to get at is that each system has a maximum capacity that they're approved for. And the tendency might be to buy a system that maxes your flow rate at that level. And obviously, if you do that, that's probably cost effective. But the reality is that most systems probably don't operate well at their maximum capacity. So I think the guidance that maybe the industry should take is you probably don't want to buy a system that's right at its maximum. You want to give yourself some safety factor there.
Excellent. So if you had a 1,000 cubic meter system, you'd want to go higher than that to buy for max capacity.
Right. So if your ballast water capacity system is 1,000 cubic meters, I'd look at buying one that's probably 1,500 cubic meters maximum, not one that's right at 1,000. Okay. And then there was sort of a related issue where the capabilities of the systems are important, and there are some manufacturers that will also suggest that, hey, you can buy a lower capacity system than your ballast system is rated for. So, for example, your system is rated for 1,000 cubic meters. We'll buy my system that's over only 500 cubic meters. And people would say, well, why would I do that? Well, because I never really operate above 500. Well, the problem with that is that may be true in your normal route, but once you do that, you're sort of permanently limiting your ballast system capacity. So I would never recommend, going below what your maximum capacity is.
Kind of painting yourself into a corner with that analogy, right? So how about the type approval upgrade? What was said there?
Yeah, so this is, again, something that's important, from a cost perspective for these owners. So this is a situation where you bought a system before it had the type approval, and now the Coast Guard is telling you, well, you have to make sure that that system that you bought before is upgraded to the level that was approved. And so in some cases, it's a minimal upgrade. Maybe it's a software thing. Maybe it's something like some vibration brackets or something like that. But there are some systems that, in order to get the approval, changed major components like electrodes or filters or UV lamps. And then if you're going to make sure your system is now in compliance with that major upgrade, you have to spend the money to do that. And so, again, the Coast Guard, I think, was warning people, don't cut a corner here. Don't think you can just change the nameplate, on the system and not actually upgrade it.
So now, what was discussed regarding hold time?
So, yeah, this is one that I think also gets a little confusing for the industry. When these approvals were first being issued, going back several years now, the Coast Guard basically had a policy that said we thought the hold time should be at least 24 hours because that's what we thought would take to kill the organisms. Well, as time goes on and systems improve, people are realizing that you can actually get these systems to kill the organisms in less than 24 hours. So now the Coast Guard is approving systems with less than a 24-hour hold time. But I think where the industry gets confused is if you see a system that's got a 24-hour hold time, you need to understand, well, was that given because that's really what it takes to kill the organisms, or was that given because that was the shortest hold time that the Coast Guard would give at the time the approval was issued? So the buyers, the vessel owners, should explore that with their manufacturers.
Now, I also understand there was a lot of discussion around alternate components. Can you go through that?
Yes, and I think that one is maybe the most significant of the items that were covered during the conference, because this affects certainly the owners on their side in trying to get a good system, cost effectively, and it affects the manufacturers because we've got production schedules to meet. There's a lot of demand right now, obviously. that the regulations are enforced. So the underlying issue is that when you got your system approved, you had a bill of materials and it identified every single component in that system. And so now here you are some months later, a year later, and you're realizing that, hey, maybe there's a different manufacturer of a component that's got some better capability, or maybe I can get a component that's the same type of thing but less expensive, and I can make my system more cost effective for my for my client. Or maybe I just don't have the demand. I mean, I'm buying everything I can from a particular manufacturer, but to meet the demand of the industry, I need to buy the same component from a different manufacturer. Well, this is a little uncertain now as to what the Coast Guard's going to require if we need to swap out a component. And I've been using sort of a spectrum analogy here, where the Coast Guard has been pretty clear that if you're using the identical component, but it's the blue color versus the green color, okay, well, that's an easy one. That swap is allowed. On the other end of the spectrum, hey, I want to use a completely different filter than the one I had approved. Well, the Coast Guard's very clear on that. You've got to go through a whole reapproval process, a whole testing process to use a different filter. But what if I'm using an identical filter, but it's just from a different manufacturer? Now, is that something that can just be swapped out, or is that something that has to be reapproved? And that's what we're waiting for the Coast Guard for some approval guidance on.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate the time you've taken again, Steve. Again, if you want to see all of these reports from the Coast Guard, it's at the Maritime Commons blog for November 12th. We've been talking to Steve Candito, who's CEO of Ecochlor, for another ballast water management report. Steve was coming to us from New York via Skype. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Dave. Good to see you again.
I'm Dave Gardy here from Maritime TV from our studios near Washington, D.C., and another ballast water management report. Thanks for joining us.